Dear Mrs. Calloway, First Midwest Bank thanks you for your generous contribution. A contribution to the Calloway Family Scholarship Fund. I stood in the kitchen and read the line again. The black ink on the white paper refused to change shape. I am Maggie Calloway. I am 47 years old. I work the night shift as a charge nurse at Riverside Hospital. I do not have a scholarship fund. I do not make generous contributions. The faint smell of antiseptic was still trapped in my hair. It was my signature scent, whether I wanted it to be or not. The yellow bulb above the sink cast long shadows across the counters. 5:47 in the morning. October in Columbus means the sky outside the window is completely black, empty of even the promise of dawn. The refrigerator ice maker clattered, dropping a fresh batch of cubes into the plastic bin. That was the only sound in the entire house. The white bank envelope sat on top of a stack of mail, the electric bill, a Target catalog, a glossy flyer for a pizza place. And this, my hands felt incredibly dry. The skin across my knuckles stretched tight when I bent my fingers. You wash your hands 100 times a shift for 11 years and the natural moisture never really comes back to your skin. I dropped my car keys into the ceramic bowl by the toaster. I left my white hospital shoes by the back door. It was a routine. I poured a glass of cold water from the tap standing by the sink and drank it down in one long pull. I had only opened the envelope because it looked official. Account statement enclosed it said on the front. I picked the paper back up. I read the name on the top right corner one more time. Mrs. L. Calloway. Loretta, my mother-in-law. So the bank had mailed it to the wrong address. But the destination printed right there below the window was 4421 Fairlawn Drive. My house. My kitchen counter. Calloway Family Scholarship Fund. I set the paper down on the cold formica. My chest felt hollow, not terrified, just empty and disoriented like missing a step in the dark. What scholarship fund? Did Neil mention something to me? Was this a charity thing Loretta was putting together for Craig and his children? Craig was Neil's younger brother. His kids went to private school. Maybe this was a tax maneuver. I looked at the wooden staircase in the hallway. Avery and Cole were asleep up there. My 16-year-old daughter, my 13-year-old son. Neil was asleep in our bedroom at the end of the hall. I could walk up those stairs. I could wake my husband up and ask him right now. But my feet felt like lead weights. The hospital shift had been 12 hours of alarms and charting, and standing on concrete floors disguised by thin linoleum. I looked at the letter. I looked back at the stairs. I would ask about it in the morning. It was probably just a clerical error, a misdirected piece of mail. I folded the crisp paper in half. I left it on the counter next to my empty water glass. I walked up the stairs slowly. The bedroom was completely dark. Neil breathed in a steady, heavy rhythm from his side of the mattress. I lay down on top of the covers. I did not take off my scrubs right away. I just stared at the shifting shadows on the ceiling. Sleep came fast and heavy long before my exhausted brain could understand why that folded piece of paper felt like a warning bell ringing in an empty room. Sunday evening arrived 5 days later. We were at Loretta's house. We were always at Loretta's house on Sundays. It was a rule written in stone 22 years ago when I married Neil, and nobody ever questioned it. I walked through the front door and the scent hit me immediately. Estee Lauder white linen perfume. Roast beef baking in the oven. Furniture polish. The smell of a house where absolutely everything is controlled, documented, and placed exactly where the owner wants it to be. I had just come off a short afternoon shift. I was tired and I was running late. Sorry I missed the appetizers, I said, stepping into the dining room. The hardwood floor squeaked under my right foot. It always squeaked in that exact spot. Loretta sat at the head of the long table. She wore a pale blue blazer and low heels, dressed perfectly for a family dinner as if she were hosting a charity gala. Craig and his wife Patrice sat on the right side. Their 3 children sat quietly, hands in their laps. My daughter Avery was on her feet clearing the empty salad plates. My son Cole sat next to his father on the left. Loretta was talking. She was always talking. They are making incredible progress, Loretta said, smiling warmly at Craig's oldest boy. St. Matthew's Catholic School has a real STEM program now, not like the public schools around here. They actually prepare these kids for the future. I pulled out my chair. Avery took my dirty salad plate away before I could even sit down. The difference was always right there in the open, woven into the fabric of the room. Craig's kids waited to be served. My daughter cleared the table. Maggie, would you like some more meat? Loretta asked. There is plenty left. Thank you. I have just enough, I said. Loretta turned her attention to Cole. She frowned. The boy is too thin. Is he eating enough at home? Mom, he is fine, Neil said softly. He did not look up from his plate. I am only asking, Loretta said. She reached over with her silver serving fork and dropped 2 thick slices of roast beef onto Cole's plate. She did not ask him if he wanted it. She simply decided he needed it, and so it was done. I picked up my fork. The brown gravy was getting cold. I listened to my mother-in-law praise the academic rigor of St. Matthew's. I thought about the tuition. It was a private Catholic school in an expensive suburb. 3 kids enrolled at the same time. That had to cost a small fortune. Craig sold insurance, but Therese worked a few days a week at a boutique. How did they afford that? The thought drifted through my mind and vanished into the background noise of dinner. I focused on eating. I reminded myself not to be overly sensitive. It was just Sunday dinner. It was just the way things were. Loretta held the power, and we sat at her table, and we smiled. Monday night, 11:47. I closed my front door behind me and locked the deadbolt. The house was utterly quiet. Neil was asleep. The faint murmur of a late-night television host bled through the bedroom wall. Up on the second floor, a thin line of yellow light glowed beneath Avery's door. She was up late studying for a history test. I walked into the dark kitchen. I did not reach for the overhead switch. The only illumination came from an open laptop sitting on the wooden kitchen table. Cole had left it running. A tab for his science homework was still active on the screen. My back ached from lifting patients all evening. I desperately wanted to go to bed, but I remembered a promise I made. Avery had come home from a college fair last week with an armful of brochures. She had asked me to check the balance of her college savings account. She wanted to know exactly where she stood before she started looking at application fees. I had promised her I would log in. I had forgotten for almost a week. I pulled out a wooden chair and sat down. The kitchen air felt chilly. The faint scent of lemon dish soap lingered around the sink. I put my fingers on the trackpad. The keyboard was warm against my skin. I opened a new browser tab. I navigated to the Ohio College Advantage portal. I typed in my username. I typed in my password. It was pure muscle memory. I clicked on Avery's designated account. The page loaded. The available balance appeared in bold black numbers across the top of the screen. $4,214.77. I stared at the screen. The blue light reflected off the dark window pane in front of me. I blinked hard. I rubbed my eyes with the heels of my hands. I looked back at the monitor. The numbers remained exactly the same. It made no sense. It was mathematically impossible. Last year, the balance was over $38,000. The year before that, it had crossed $45,000. I knew these numbers by heart. I had built these numbers with my own 2 hands. I remembered working 3 extra shifts a week back in 2019 just to hit a deposit goal before the end of the year. Every birthday check from relatives, every tax refund, every spare dollar we could squeeze out of the grocery budget went into this account. Since Avery was 7 years old, my right hand started to tremble. I pressed my palm flat against the tabletop to force it still. I clicked on the transaction history tab. The page refreshed with a spinning gray circle. A long list of red numbers populated the screen. Withdrawals, dozens of them. I scrolled down. The first one happened 14 months ago, August of last year, $4,200. Then September, $5,000. Then October, $3,800. 23 separate transactions spread over 14 months. None of them were large enough to trigger an automatic bank alert. None of them went over $10,000. They were carefully measured, systematically scheduled wires, destination account, Callaway Family Scholarship Fund. My throat closed up. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt too thin to breathe. I clicked back to the main dashboard. I opened Cole's savings account. It was the exact same story, 14 months. Regular methodical withdrawals. Wire sent directly to the exact same external account. I pulled my phone out of my scrub pocket. I opened the calculator application. My thumb hovered over the glass screen for a second. I started typing. I added the total withdrawn funds from Avery's account. I added the total stolen from Cole's account. I hit the equal sign. $63,215.44. Gone. What is the Callaway Family Scholarship Fund? I whispered into the dark room. Nobody answered. The refrigerator motor hummed its low, steady song. I sat frozen in the chair. I could not feel my legs. I thought about my daughter. I thought about Avery's face when she came home from that college fair. The absolute joy in her voice when she talked about the architecture program at Ohio State University. She thought she was secure. She thought her parents had protected her future. And then my brain finally connected the jagged pieces. I stood up. My chair scraped loudly against the linoleum floor. I did not care if the noise woke Neil. I walked over to the kitchen counter. I dug frantically through the pile of mail, the electric bill, the Target catalog, the pizza flyer. I found it near the bottom, the white envelope from First Midwest Bank. I pulled out the folded paper. I brought it over to the laptop. I held it in the blue glow of the computer screen. Dear Mrs. L. Callaway, First Midwest Bank, thanks you for your generous contribution to the Callaway Family Scholarship Fund. Loretta. I looked at the bank statement on the screen. There was a routing number listed next to the outgoing wire transfers. I opened a new tab. I searched the state charity registry for a Callaway Family Scholarship Fund. Nothing came up. It was not a registered charity. It was not a legitimate educational organization. I logged into our primary checking account portal and ran a routing search on the destination account number. It was a standard personal checking account. Account opening date, July 17th of last year. Exactly 1 month before the very first withdrawal drained from Avery's fund. Account holder name, Loretta Ann Callaway. I lowered the paper. I looked at the screen. I looked at the paper again. I did not cry. There were no tears anywhere near my eyes. There was only a cold hard knot forming at the base of my throat. It felt exactly like swallowing broken glass. She did this. My mother-in-law created a fake fund, gained access to my children's money, and systematically drained it over a year and a half to pay for Craig's kids to go to private school. I did not stand up. I did not walk down the dark hallway and throw open the bedroom door to scream at my sleeping husband. I just sat there in the shadows. The house was exactly the same as it had been 20 minutes ago. The television still murmured. Avery's light still glowed safely under her door, but the floor beneath my feet had completely vanished. Wednesday morning brought the kind of flat gray Ohio sky that makes the entire world look tired. I drove downtown to Broad Street. The traffic was heavy crawling, bumper to bumper past the tall office buildings. I found a spot in a parking structure 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance. The wind coming off the Scioto River was sharp and cold. It bit straight through my thin jacket. Midwest Capital Partners occupied the 4th floor of a glass and steel building. I took the elevator up. The doors opened with a soft chime. The carpet in the hallway was a dark, serious green. It swallowed the sound of my shoes completely. The central air conditioning pushed a low, steady hum through the vents overhead. The air smelled like fresh printer paper and the sharp chemical scent of new plastic binders. Phil Garrett sat behind a white oak desk in an office with glass walls. 2 large computer monitors formed a barricade between us. He was drinking dark coffee from a heavy ceramic cup that had no handle. He set it down when I walked in. I did not sit down right away. I pulled the white bank letter from my purse. I placed it directly in the center of his leather desk blotter. Phil looked at the paper. He opened his top drawer, took out his wire-rimmed reading glasses, and put them on. He read the letter. He read it a second time. I took a seat in the guest chair. The leather was cold against my back. Phil looked up. Do you know about this account? No, I said. My voice was perfectly level. I do not. Phil turned his attention to his left monitor. He began typing. The clicking of his keyboard sounded like small stones dropping onto a glass table. Let me pull up the account history for the two kids, he said. A long silence stretched across the room. I watched his eyes scan the screen. I watched the slight tightening around the corners of his mouth. Phil is a man who deals with market crashes and panic clients for a living. He does not show reaction often. When he stopped typing and took a slow, deep breath, I knew the numbers on his screen matched the numbers I had calculated in my dark kitchen. Maggie, Phil said quietly. I saw it, I told him. I logged in last week. I saw the withdrawals. Phil took his glasses off. He folded the arms and set them carefully on the desk. I sent an email to Neil about this, Phil said. 6 weeks ago. The air in the room stopped moving. The low hum of the air conditioner faded into pure static in my ears. Show me, I said. Phil turned the left monitor outward so it faced me. The screen displayed his sent mail folder. The date was right there at the top, September 3rd. The subject line read regarding account activity, alert for Avery and Cole. I read the body of the email. It detailed the unusual volume of withdrawals. It explicitly asked for immediate confirmation. He did not reply, Phil said softly. 6 weeks. 42 days. My mind began to catalog everything that had happened in the last 42 days. Avery had brought home her report card. Cole had celebrated his 13th birthday. We had hosted a Sunday dinner for Craig and Patrice. Neil had sat at the head of our table cutting a birthday cake, smiling at our children, carrying this email in his pocket the entire time. How does she have access? I asked. My throat felt incredibly dry. Phil turned the monitor back. Loretta was added as a secondary account holder 3 years ago. On paper, she has the technical clearance to view the accounts and execute transactions. But a college savings plan carries a fiduciary obligation to the designated beneficiary. That means Avery and Cole. He picked up his coffee cup. He did not drink. He just held the warm ceramic in both hands. Taking those funds and diverting them to a different non-approved educational expense for someone who is not listed as a beneficiary is a violation of that fiduciary duty. Under Ohio law, taking money that does not belong to you, even if you have administrative access to the portal, is theft by conversion. Theft, the word hung in the sterile office air. Phil leaned forward. What do you want me to do next? I looked at the blank back of his monitor. $63,215.44. I was missing exactly that much money. I was also missing the last 6 weeks of my marriage. Is Neil coming here? I asked. I called him before you arrived, Phil said. He is on his way. 12 minutes passed. The longest 12 minutes of my life. I sat perfectly still in the leather chair. I did not look at my phone. I did not look out the massive window at the city buses crawling down Broad Street. I stared at the dark green carpet. I counted my breaths. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4 seconds. Exhale for 4 seconds. It was a grounding technique I used when a patient was crashing. I was trying to keep my own heart from beating out of my chest. The glass door opened. Neil walked in. He was wearing his gray CD Facilities manager jacket. His hair was slightly windblown. He stopped just inside the doorway. He looked at me. He looked at Phil. He looked at the computer screen. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not ask why I was here. His shoulders dropped heavily. He looked down at the wooden desk. It was the face of a man who had postponed a terrible conversation for far too long, and now the bill had finally come due. We left Phil Garrett behind his dual monitors. We walked to the elevator bank in total silence. The ride down to the parking garage took exactly 40 seconds. Neither of us looked at the other. We watched the illuminated floor numbers count down. 4, 3, 2, 1. Garage. The underground parking structure was vast and echoey. The air down there smelled heavily of damp concrete, old motor oil, and the faint metallic tang of car exhaust. Long fluorescent tubes hummed violently overhead. They cast a sickly flickering yellow light across the rows of parked cars. The muffled rumble of tires moving on the street above vibrated through the low concrete ceiling. We stopped next to my sedan. Neil stood by the driver's side door. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. He took them out. He put them back in. He did not reach for me. He knew better than to touch me right now. 3 years ago, Neil started. His voice echoed slightly against the damp walls. Mom asked me to put her name on the accounts, just as a secondary contact. She said it was a safety measure. Just in case of an emergency, if you and I were traveling or unavailable, someone else needed to have administrative access. I kept my hand flat against the cold metal roof of my car. If I let the anger take over, I would start screaming, and if I started screaming, I might never stop. So I shut it down. I shifted into the exact same mental state I used in the intensive care unit when a medical crisis erupted. Assess the damage. Identify the source of the bleeding. Decide on the immediate next action. Panic serves no one. Emotion is a luxury you afford yourself only after the bleeding stops. You signed a bank form, I said. You did not ask a lawyer. You did not ask me. I thought it was just access, Neil pleaded. He took a step closer. I swear to you, Maggie, I thought it was just so she could talk to the bank if we were incapacitated. I never thought it gave her the right to withdraw the funds. I let 3 full seconds pass. A sedan drove past us in the driving lane. Its headlights swept briefly across our faces, casting sharp, moving shadows against the concrete pillar behind Neil. Do you think your mother knows the difference? I asked. Neil stared at me. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence stretched out heavy and suffocating in the cold garage air. That is the question you need to answer, I told him. I pulled my keys from my purse. I unlocked the car door. I did not wait for him to find his voice. I got and started the engine and drove up the concrete ramp toward the gray daylight, leaving him standing there in the yellow glow. Thursday, 2 o'clock in the morning. The intensive care unit at Riverside Hospital operates in a state of suspended animation during the middle of the night. The hallway lights are always dimmed to a pale ghostly blue to let the patients rest. The air is deliberately cool. The only sounds are the rhythmic mechanical breaths of the ventilators pushing air into damaged lungs and the steady high-pitched beeps of the heart monitors. It is a world entirely separated from the normal flow of time. I stood at the central charting station. I dragged my finger down a patient record. I read the same line of medication dosages 4 times without absorbing a single word. Roz walked up beside me. She is 55 years old. She has been a trauma and critical care nurse for 30 years. She has seen every possible way a human body can fail, and she has seen every possible way families fall apart in waiting rooms. She set a stack of fresh white towels on the counter. She did not walk away. You have been standing in that exact spot for 20 minutes, Roz noted. Her voice was a quiet gravel scratch. I am reviewing chart notes, I said. Roz leaned against the high counter. She crossed her arms over her faded blue scrubs. You look like someone trying to solve a math problem that has a fixed answer, but you keep hoping the numbers will magically change. I closed the medical folder. I looked down the long, dim hallway. A solitary cleaning cart sat parked outside room 4. Roz, I said slowly, how do you tell the difference between being loyal to your family and just being afraid to break something? Roz did not blink. She looked at me with those tired, knowing eyes. She had been married twice and raised 3 kids on a nurse salary. She possessed a terrifying ability to see straight through the polite fictions people constructed around themselves. The thing is already broken, Maggie, she said softly. You just have not looked at it yet. A monitor alarm chimed in room 7. Roz pushed off the counter and walked away to answer it, her white rubber shoes squeaking faintly on the polished floor. I walked down the hall to the small staff break room to get a cup of stale coffee. The overhead fluorescent light flickered. The coffee was burned and bitter. The thin styrofoam cup grew hot against my fingertips. I stood entirely alone by the humming vending machines. The thing is already broken. The words follow me out of the break room. They follow me through the rest of my 12-hour shift. They echoed in my ears every time I checked a pulse, every time I adjusted a tangled intravenous line, every time I washed my hands in the small stainless steel sinks. I was not ready to admit she was right. I wanted to believe I could fix this quietly. I wanted to believe my husband could fix this. But the cold clarity that had settled deep into my bones down in that parking garage was growing stronger by the hour. I knew exactly what Loretta had taken. I knew exactly where the money went. I knew my husband had tried to hide it from me. The damage was already done. The vessel was already shattered. The only thing left to decide was what I was going to do with the pieces. I unrolled a large sheet of white butcher paper across the kitchen table. I used 2 heavy coffee mugs to hold down the curling corners. The thick black marker squeaked loudly against the paper as I drew a long vertical line down the center. Column A on the left, column B on the right. It was Saturday morning. Cole was down the street at a friend's house. Avery was upstairs in her bedroom, the muffled sound of a morning television show drifting down through the ceiling. Neil sat across from me at the table. He watched my hand move the marker. He did not offer to help. He just watched the black ink bleed into the white paper. My laptop sat at the far end of the table. Phil Garrett looked out at us through the screen on a video call. His home office was visible in the background, lined with dark wooden bookshelves. Phil read the dates and amounts from the bank records he had pulled. I wrote them in the left column. August 15th, $4,200. September 2nd, $3,800. Then he read the tuition installment due dates for St. Matthew's Catholic School. I wrote those in the right column. August 18th, September 5th. The pattern locked together flawlessly. Every single time a tuition payment was required for Craig's 3 children, a withdrawal hit Avery and Cole's accounts exactly 2 or 3 days prior. Tuition at St. Matthew's this year is $18,400 for all 3 kids, Phil said through the small computer speakers. That includes the parish multi-child discount. I looked at the long column of numbers I had just written. My coffee was completely cold in the mug holding down the paper. I did not want to drink it anyway, and the total withdrawn during the active school year is $19,100, I said to the screen. A heavy silence filled the kitchen. I set the black marker down. It made a sharp clicking sound against the wood table. Neil shifted in his chair. He rubbed the back of his neck. Mom probably took a little extra for uniforms and school supplies, Neil said quietly. Nobody said anything for 3 full seconds. The television murmured upstairs. The refrigerator motor kicked on. I kept my eyes focused entirely on the paper. The sheer reflex of his defense was almost worse than the theft itself. He was still trying to rationalize the math. Neil, I said. My voice was completely flat. Knowing about this means you agreed to it. Do you understand that? He looked away. He stared at the kitchen cabinets. I did not wait for him to find a better excuse. The time for being confused was over. I had a map in front of me now, and I was going to follow it wherever it led. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, I was pulling my sedan into Loretta's driveway. I walked up to the front door, holding a warm glass baking pan covered in aluminum foil. Inside was a batch of homemade cornbread. It was the most harmless domestic cover story I could invent. I rang the doorbell. Loretta opened the door with a bright, welcoming smile. A massive wave of Estee Lauder white linen perfume washed over me, mixing heavily with the smell of roasting chicken wafting from her kitchen. Her house was immaculately clean. Every throw pillow on the sofa sat at a perfect 45-degree angle. Every magazine on the coffee table lined up exactly with the edge of the glass. I stepped inside. My right foot hit the hardwood floorboard near the entryway. It squeaked the exact same way it has squeaked for 22 years. The house felt overly warm, almost stifling against the crisp October afternoon outside. The golden sunlight poured through the large bay windows, illuminating tiny dust motes dancing in the dead air. We went into the kitchen. Loretta poured hot water into 2 delicate porcelain teacups. She asked about the autumn weather. She asked about my shifts at the hospital. We sat at the kitchen island, occupying the exact same stools we always use for these little visits. "Where is Avery looking for college?" Loretta asked, blowing gently on her tea. She's still looking, I said carefully. We have a few options on the table. Loretta set her cup down on a matching saucer. Ohio State is a very good school. It is much more economical than a private university. You have to be smart about these things. I looked directly at her carefully powdered face. Not a single trace of guilt existed in her eyes. Yes, I said. We are doing the math on that right now. Loretta stood up to check the roasting chicken in the oven. I placed my hands flat on the smooth marble counter. Would you mind if I used the printer in your home office? I asked. Our machine at home is completely jammed, and I need to print a few scheduling documents for work. Loretta did not even turn around. She opened the oven door. The smell of rosemary and garlic filled the room. Make yourself at home, Maggie. You know where everything is. I walked down the short hallway to the home office. I stepped inside and closed the door until it was just barely cracked open. I turned on the small brass desk lamp. I had been in this room dozens of times over the years. I had helped her organize insurance paperwork after her husband passed away. I knew this heavy mahogany desk. I knew the tall metal filing cabinet in the corner. I walked over to the desk. The printer sat on a side table. Next to the printer was a neat stack of blank printer paper. And right in the center of the mahogany desk sat a bright green plastic folder. A white adhesive label was perfectly centered on the front cover. It read, Callaway Family Scholarship Fund Distribution Log in neat black capital letters. My breath caught in my throat. I did not touch the folder. I did not want to leave fingerprints or disturb its exact placement on the desk. The green plastic cover was slightly transparent. I pulled my phone from my scrub pocket. I opened the camera application. I held my breath to keep my hands completely steady and took a clear photograph of the front page through the plastic. I could see the neatly ruled columns printed on the paper inside. Date, amount, recipient, purpose. It was meticulously maintained. Every single withdrawal was documented. I looked over at the printer. I noticed the top sheet of the paper stack in the loading tray was not entirely blank. I leaned closer. It had a custom printed header at the top. Callaway Family Scholarship Fund. It featured a small professionally designed logo of a golden flame hovering over an open book. The address listed beneath the logo was Loretta's home address. The contact email was callawayfund@gmail.com. I raised my phone and took a photograph of the letterhead as well. I stood completely still in the quiet office. The low hum of the computer tower under the desk vibrated through the floorboards and up through my shoes. I realized exactly what I was looking at. This was not a moment of panic. This was not a grandmother impulsively transferring money in the middle of the night to help out a struggling son. This was a fully operational system. She had designed a logo. She had ordered custom stationery. She maintained a distribution log. She had built an entire administrative infrastructure to legitimize taking my children's future. It was a terrifying level of premeditation. It told me one very clear thing. She did not believe she was doing anything wrong. She saw herself as the supreme manager of the family resources. Heavy footsteps sounded on the hardwood floor out in the hallway. The familiar squeak of the entryway board echoed through the quiet house. I locked my phone screen and shoved the device deep into my pocket. I stepped quickly toward the side table and pressed the wake button on the printer display panel. Loretta pushed the office door open. "Did you get it to print?" she asked. "I actually just remembered I can email these documents to myself at the nurse station," I said. I offered her a small apologetic smile. "I do not need paper copies after all. Thank you anyway." I walked past her, back into the suffocating warmth of the hallway, carrying the entire truth safely in my pocket. Monday morning brought a cold biting rain to the Columbus suburbs. I met Phil Garrett inside the local branch of First Midwest Bank at 9 o'clock. The air conditioning inside the building was turned up far too high. It carried the sterile scent of industrial carpet cleaner and the faint ozone smell of large copy machines working in the back rooms. We sat in a small glass-walled cubicle with a branch manager. Because my name was listed as a primary joint account holder on both of the college funds, I had full legal standing to request the complete 14-month transaction history. Loretta was only listed as a secondary name. She could not block my access. The manager clicked rapidly through his system, his eyes darting back and forth across the screen. He excused himself to go to the back printing room to process the official records. Phil and I sat alone in the quiet cubicle. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, textured business card. He slid it across the fake wood desk toward me. I picked it up. The name read Dana Okafor. Beneath that it read, Senior Compliance Officer. Who is this? I asked. Someone I know over in the corporate compliance department, Phil said softly. A lawyer looks at this situation from your side of the table. Dana looks at it from the bank side. And sometimes the bank knows a lot more about what is happening than you might think. I traced the raised lettering on the card with my thumb. Compliance Officer. It sounded serious. It sounded like something that could not be swept under a rug at a Sunday family dinner. The branch manager returned a moment later. He handed me a thick stack of stapled papers. I took them in both hands. The pages were still physically warm from the laser printer. The weight of that paper in my hands felt entirely different than the thin envelope I had opened just 6 days ago. I was no longer standing in the dark, wondering where the floor had gone. I was gathering the bricks to build a fortress, and Loretta had absolutely no idea I was coming. Wednesday evening arrived quietly. I sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was completely silent. The thick stack of bank records rested on the bare wood in front of me. I had carried a small brass reading lamp down from the spare bedroom to avoid turning on the harsh overhead lights. The lamp cast a tight, unforgiving circle of yellow illumination over the printed pages. My blue ink pen scratched softly against the paper. I was drawing a tiny circle next to every single withdrawal date. Phil Garrett was on the phone. I had the device on speaker mode, resting flat on a folded paper towel. His voice came through the small speaker, calm and measured. Do you see the pattern emerging? Phil asked. I dragged the tip of my pen down the right side of the page. $2,800, $4,100, $6,200. I see it, I said. None of these individual transfers ever go over $10,000. Exactly, Phil replied. $10,000 is the mandatory reporting threshold for the Internal Revenue Service. Banks are legally required to automatically flag and report any cash transactions or suspicious wire transfers that cross that exact number. Whoever set up this withdrawal schedule knew exactly how to fly just under the radar. I stared at the blue circles bleeding slightly into the cheap printer paper. My husband's mother was a retired middle school vice principal. She spent her career organizing bus schedules and disciplining teenagers. She absolutely did not know about federal banking regulations. A heavy, suffocating pause filled the kitchen. Who helped her? I asked. Does Craig hold an active insurance license? Phil asked carefully. I seem to recall Neil mentioning that his brother works with structured financial products. The air in the kitchen grew instantly cold. Craig, Neil's younger brother, the man who had carried heavy cardboard boxes into our first house, dripping with summer sweat. The man who sat at our table every single Thanksgiving and fell asleep on our living room sofa while the football game played on television. Are you suggesting Craig told his mother how to structure these withdrawals? I asked. My voice sounded entirely hollow. It did not sound like me at all. I am only saying the pattern on those pages is far too perfect for an amateur to execute, Phil said. I looked at the bottom of the final page. $63,215.44. The number was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. It was no longer just a betrayal by one woman. The deception had branches, it had roots. Friday afternoon arrived with a sharp, clear blue sky. It was 3:15. The air in Columbus smelled of dry October leaves, turning brittle and turning to dust on the branches. I sat inside my sedan in the outer parking lot of St. Matthew's Catholic School. I had absolutely no logical reason to be there. I had finished my errands. I had simply kept driving, and the car had brought me to the exact place where my children's future was being spent. The final dismissal bell rang out. The loud metallic sound drifted across the vast expanse of asphalt. The heavy wooden double doors of the brick school building swung open. Hundreds of children flooded out into the bright autumn sunshine. I kept my car parked far away from the active pickup line. I watched the parents gather on the sidewalks. I watched the expensive luxury utility vehicles idle in a long, neat row, their exhaust pipes sending small white clouds into the crisp air. Then I saw them. Craig's 3 children. They wore matching navy blue blazers and crisp white uniform shirts. The oldest boy was 11 years old. He carried a heavy canvas backpack slung over his right shoulder. He was laughing loudly at something his younger sister had just said. I rested my forehead against the cold leather of my steering wheel. I closed my eyes for a long moment. Those kids knew absolutely nothing. They were just going to school. They were learning math and reading history books and playing with their friends on the playground. They were completely, entirely innocent. If I moved forward with what I knew I had to do, I would not just be exposing Loretta. I would be pulling the rug entirely out from under those 3 children in the middle of their academic year. They would lose their school. They would lose their daily routine. They would pay a terrible price for a crime they did not commit. I lifted my head and looked through the windshield. Craig was walking across the parking lot. He wore a sharp gray suit. He held a leather briefcase in his left hand. He raised his right hand and pressed the button on his car remote. The headlights of his dark utility vehicle flashed twice. The sharp chirp echoed across the pavement. I lowered my driver's side window a tiny fraction of an inch. The cool autumn wind slipped inside the car. Craig was smiling. He knelt down on the asphalt and hugged his youngest daughter tightly. He did not look in my direction. He had absolutely no idea I was sitting 200 feet away, holding the power to dismantle his entire life. I watched him load the children into the back seat of his vehicle. I did not feel powerful. I felt sick to my stomach. But then another thought surfaced from the dark water of my mind, a cold, unyielding truth. If I did nothing, my own children would pay the price. Avery would open her college portal in 2 short years and find absolutely nothing but dust and empty promises. Cole would have doors slammed in his face before he even learned how to knock. Craig's children were not my enemy, but they were not my responsibility either. The woman who stole the money created this collision, not me. I rolled the window back up. The glass sealed tight against the frame. I put the car in drive. I could not solve this quietly inside the walls of the family. The rut went far too deep. I pressed the accelerator and drove out of the parking lot. Saturday night descended quietly over the house. The neighborhood was completely still. Cole was fast asleep upstairs in his room. Avery was spending the weekend at a friend's house. Neil and I sat in the living room. The television screen was dark. Our mobile phones were left on the kitchen counter. The only illumination in the room came from the tall floor lamp standing in the far corner. It cast a warm yellow glow over the worn fabric of our sofa. The wooden wall clock ticked steadily. Each second dropped into the quiet room like a heavy stone hitting the bottom of a dry well. A ceramic mug of herbal tea sat on the wooden coaster in front of Neil. It was completely cold. He had not touched it once. We had never sat like this before, without distractions, without the buffer of children or household chores or simple exhaustion. We were just 2 adults sitting in the silent wreckage of a 22-year marriage. If we do this, Neil said finally. His voice was incredibly low and rough. If we move forward with this, there is no taking it back. You understand that? I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap. Do you think doing nothing takes it back? Neil looked down at his empty hands. My mother would never admit she did something malicious. She does not see the world that way, Neil, I said. I waited for him to lift his head and look at me. 6 weeks. You waited 6 weeks. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder in the space between us. I know, he whispered. You called Phil Garrett before I ever logged into the computer, I told him. My voice did not rise. It did not shake. It was perfectly level. You knew there was a massive problem. You knew the money was gone. That is the only reason I am still sitting in this room with you tonight. He leaned forward slowly. He rested his elbows on his knees. He began to talk about his mother in a way I had never heard him speak before. It was not an excuse. It was a dissection. He talked about how she had raised 2 boys entirely alone after his father died unexpectedly. He talked about how she had decided very early on that she was the absolute authority on what was right and what was wrong in the world. She believed she was the ultimate judge of fairness. If Craig needed money and we had savings, she simply moved the pieces on the board to balance the equation. She did not see it as stealing. She saw it as managing her family. Neil had learned to survive his childhood by never questioning the manager. He had learned that keeping the peace cost significantly less emotional energy than standing his ground. I looked closely at my husband. He was 49 years old. He was a facilities manager for the city of Columbus. He had gray hair creeping in at his temples, and he was just now tonight waking up from a lifetime of submission. I did not need him to be a perfect hero. I did not need him to have all the answers. I just needed him to choose the right side when the absolute worst moment arrived. The question was not whether he was a good man. The question was what he was going to choose right now. Neil looked up from his hands. He met my eyes. The hesitation was gone. "We do this together," he said. His voice was finally steady. "I will call Dana Okafor on Monday." I did not reach out to hold his hand. I did not offer a tearful smile. I just nodded my head once. I looked past his shoulder. A large framed photograph hung on the living room wall. It was taken 5 years ago at our Thanksgiving dinner. Loretta stood perfectly in the center. She wore a tailored navy blazer. Her hands rested firmly on the shoulders of her two sons. She was smiling a bright, confident smile for the camera. I would always remember the smell of Estee Lauder white linen filling my dining room. I would always remember her cutting the holiday turkey and passing the plates down the table. I would always remember the way she looked at my children and called them her babies. Those memories were completely real, but remembering a kindness does not mean you simply ignore a crime. I looked back at Neil. The tea on the table was dead cold. The clock kept ticking against the wall. We had a team. The false peace was finally over. Neil made the telephone call early Sunday morning. He stood by the kitchen sink, holding the device to his ear while I poured coffee. His voice was quiet and deliberate. "Mom, Maggie and I are coming over this afternoon. We have something we need to discuss." Loretta asked what the problem was. I could hear the teeny sound of her voice through the receiver. "It is better if we talk in person," Neil told her. "We will be there at 2 o'clock. We arrived exactly on time." Loretta opened her front door before Neil even had a chance to press the doorbell. She wore a tailored light blue blazer and her best pearl earrings. It was her Sunday finest, the armor she wore when she was expecting an important audience. She knew this was not a normal weekend visit. A heavy, suffocating wave of Estee Lauder white linen perfume washed over us in the entryway. She had sprayed extra. The house was immaculately, painfully clean. The vacuum marks on the living room rug formed perfect, undisturbed parallel lines. She led us into the sitting area. A silver tray sat perfectly centered on the glass coffee table. It held 3 crystal glasses of ice water and a small porcelain plate of lemon pastries. She had arranged the battlefield and controlled the setting before we even stepped across her threshold. I did not sit down on the plush sofa. I stood near the edge of the glass table. I carried the thick green folder in my right hand. I dropped it directly onto the glass surface right next to her carefully arranged pastry plate. It landed with a heavy, flat thud. I skipped the pleasantries. I did not ask about her weekend. "You withdrew $63,215 from the college accounts belonging to Avery and Cole over the last 14 months. Loretta looked down at the green plastic folder. Her hands remained neatly folded together in front of her light blue blazer. She did not reach out to touch the documents. "I do not know what you are talking about," Loretta said. Her tone was completely smooth. I reached down and flipped the green plastic cover open. I spread the bank records across the glass table. The long columns of dates and withdrawal amounts covered the polished surface. "First Midwest Bank. Transaction history," I said. "Would you like to review the dates?" Loretta pulled her shoulders back. Her posture stiffened into a rigid line of absolute authority. She refused to look at the papers. She looked directly at her son instead. "Neil, you let your wife come into my home with this tone." Neil sat on the edge of the sofa cushion. He leaned forward and pointed at the spread of documents. "Mom, look at those papers. Please." The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The polite, welcoming host vanished completely. I have access to that account, Loretta said. Her voice grew hard and sharp. You gave me that access yourself, Neil. You signed the forms. I signed forms so you could talk to the bank in an emergency, Neil pleaded. Not so you could drain the funds. I have done everything for this family, Loretta countered. She lifted her chin, taking on the mantle of the absolute victim. For my 2 boys. For my grandchildren. Craig needed help. He has 3 growing children to put through a good school. I am the only person in this family who thinks about the entire picture. You and Maggie are doing fine. I kept my hands flat against my sides. My jaw ached. I had been grinding my teeth since we pulled into her driveway. Those accounts have Avery and Cole listed as the beneficiaries, I said, lowering my voice until it was barely above a whisper. Not Craig. Not his children. It is family money, Loretta insisted, genuinely puzzled by my resistance. No, it is the money of 2 children. I watched her face very closely. I expected to see a flicker of guilt. I expected her to cry or to offer some kind of desperate apology now that she was trapped by the evidence. But her eyes were completely clear. Her back was perfectly straight. A terrifying realization settled deep into my bones. She did not feel any remorse because she genuinely believed she had done nothing wrong. In her mind, she was the supreme manager of the Calloway family resources. She was simply redistributing wealth from the child who had enough to the child who needed more. This was not a panic theft. This was total conviction. Neil stared at his mother. The last illusion he held about her seemed to shatter right there in the quiet living room. Mom, Neil said softly, "You need to talk to a lawyer." Loretta scoffed. It was a short, bitter sound. I do not need a lawyer. I did nothing wrong. I looked at her sitting in her perfect blue blazer, surrounded by her perfect vacuum lines. No argument in this room was ever going to change her mind. She was not afraid of the law. She was afraid of losing her position at the absolute center of our universe. Admitting fault would mean surrendering her crown, and she would burn the entire family to the ground before she ever apologized. Loretta stood up. She smoothed the front of her jacket. She had decided the conversation was over. "I think you need to take a long look at what you are doing to this family, Maggie," she said. I reached down and gathered the bank records. I placed them back inside the green folder. I did not offer her a single word in reply. We turned around and walked out the front door, leaving the lemon pastries entirely untouched. The drive home was suffocatingly quiet. The late afternoon streetlights flickered on as we navigated the empty suburban streets. The car windows began to fog slightly at the edges from the cold October air pressing against the glass. Neil kept both hands gripped tightly on the steering wheel. A sudden vibration rattled from the center console. His mobile phone screen lit up the dark cabin. He picked up the device at a red traffic light. He read the screen. He let out a long, exhausted breath and handed the phone across the console to me. It was a text message from his mother. "You should not let your wife do that. I will make it right later. They are blowing it out of proportion." I read the 2 sentences. The blue light from the screen illuminated the dark interior of the car. "Take a screenshot of this," I told him. "Why?" Neil asked. His voice sounded completely drained. Saying she will make it right is a direct admission that she did something wrong. Our lawyer is going to find that sentence very useful. The phone vibrated in my hand again. An incoming call. The name Loretta flashed across the screen in bright white letters. Neil reached over and pressed the red button to send the call directly to voicemail. I turned my head and looked out the passenger window. I had a night shift at the hospital in exactly 4 hours. The sheer normalcy of that impending routine anchored me to the ground. I would put on my scrubs. I would check patient charts. I would wash my hands in the stainless steel sinks. The world was fracturing into pieces, but the hospital monitors would still beep. The pragmatic reality of the situation began to override the emotional shock. We had just walked out of a terrible confrontation, but we had walked out carrying a written admission of guilt handed to us by her own absolute arrogance. Tuesday morning arrived with a bitter, biting wind. Phil Garrett had arranged a meeting for me at the corporate offices of First Midwest Bank. I drove downtown and found myself sitting inside a small windowless conference room on the 8th floor. The space was entirely devoid of comfort. Stark white panels glowed harshly overhead. A monotonous hum from the central air conditioning system vibrated through the thin carpet. A clear glass of ice water sat on the cheap wood veneer table in front of me. The condensation dripped slowly down the sides. Dana Okafor sat across the table. She wore a severe dark suit. She moved with precise economical gestures. She was a senior compliance officer, and she did not engage in any small talk about the weather or the morning traffic. Dana opened a manila folder and folded her hands over the documents. The bank flagged the unusual activity during the 4th month of the withdrawal cycle, Dana explained. Her voice carried no emotional color whatsoever. The pattern was highly specific. The withdrawals were consistent in frequency. They never exceeded $10,000, and the destination was an unrecognized external account. I watched her hands resting on the table. Under the Bank Secrecy Act, Dana continued, our institution is legally required to monitor this type of structured withdrawal. It is a classic signature for evasion. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Heavy black marker covered most of the text. It was heavily redacted. First Midwest filed a suspicious activity report. Internally, Dana said. That report was officially submitted to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. A heavy weight settled into the pit of my stomach. The air in the windowless room suddenly felt incredibly thin. Has your family filed a formal police report yet? Dana asked. No, I replied. Dana looked at me with flat, serious eyes. Mrs. Calloway, you need to understand that our internal compliance process will continue regardless of what your family decide to do today or tomorrow. The report is already filed in the federal system. I looked down at the redacted paper. The implications locked into place one by one. That means this story currently has 2 paths, Dana said softly. One path is controlled by your family. The other path is not. The humming of the air conditioner seemed to grow louder. Which means I need to make a decision quickly, I said. It means you need to decide if you want to be ahead of the story or if you want to let the story get ahead of you. I looked at the untouched water glass on the table. The small puddle of condensation had soaked into the wood grain. The illusion that Neil and I could handle this quietly inside the walls of our own family evaporated completely into the sterile air of the banking office. I had walked into Loretta's house hoping for an explanation, and I had walked out with a war. Now the federal banking machine was already moving beneath our feet. The timeline was no longer ours to control. The illusion that we could control this situation shattered completely 2 days later. Thursday morning broke with a pale, weak light that barely pushed through the kitchen windows. I stood by the coffee maker. I watched the dark liquid drip slowly into the glass pot. The ceramic mug in my hands was already growing cold. Upstairs, the heavy familiar thud of Cole getting out of bed vibrated through the hardwood ceiling. It was a perfectly ordinary morning, right up until Neil opened his laptop. Neil sat at the wooden table. He had been staring at his email inbox for 10 minutes. The silence in the kitchen shifted. It grew dense and heavy. We got a response, Neil said. His voice sounded thin. I walked over and stood behind his chair. I looked at the bright screen. The email came from Clifford and Associates, a law firm located in the expensive district of downtown Columbus. I was copied on the message. The subject line read, regarding the Calloway Family Scholarship Fund dispute. Neil began to read the text aloud. His voice wavered on the legal phrasing. The attorney stated clearly that Neil had voluntarily granted his mother access to the accounts. They possessed a signed access form to prove it. Therefore, according to their legal interpretation, every single transaction fell completely within the scope of her granted authority. Loretta had broken absolutely no laws. The email ended with a strong recommendation that our family cease this unnecessary escalation immediately. They are saying the access form is enough legal right, Neil whispered. He looked up at me. His eyes were wide and uncertain. Call Phil Garrett right now, I told him. Neil did not reach for his phone. He rubbed his hands over his face. Craig called me late last night while you were at work. I froze. The name of his younger brother hung in the cold morning air. He knows about the dispute, Neil continued. Mom told him everything. Craig told me we need to let this go. He told me to leave it alone and keep the peace. I stared at my husband. I watched the hesitation pulling at his shoulders. He was caught between the family he came from and the family he had built. Neil, I said. I kept my voice incredibly steady. You are choosing a second time. He looked at the open laptop. He looked at the cold cup of coffee on the table. He picked up his mobile phone and dialed Phil. That afternoon, I sat inside my car in the massive parking lot outside Riverside Hospital. A cold November rain had started to fall across Columbus. The drops hit the windshield in a steady drumming rhythm. I had the car engine running to keep the heater blowing against my frozen feet. Phil Garrett was speaking through the vehicle speaker system. The access form grants her the ability to view the balance and manage the portal, Phil explained over the sound of the rain. It does not grant her distribution rights. Ohio Revised Code Section 1339.69 is incredibly clear on this matter. A custodian of an account meant for a minor must act exclusively for the benefit of that specific minor, not for the general benefit of the family, not to redistribute wealth. The money belongs to the beneficiary named on the account. Does her lawyer know this? I asked. I watched the wiper blades sweep back and forth across the wet glass. Of course they know it, Phil said flatly. That is exactly why their email did not claim she had the right to spend the money. They only claimed she had access. Those are two entirely different legal concepts, and they are desperately hoping you do not know the difference. A heavy truck drove past my parked car. The tires hissed loudly against the wet asphalt. Why would they send an official letter if they know they are wrong? I asked. Because they want to see if you have the patience to fight them, Phil said. They are betting that you would choose a quiet peace over a loud war. You need a civil attorney right now, Maggie. We have not even discussed filing a lawsuit, I replied. The word felt massive and dangerous in my mouth. You do not need to sue her today, Phil told me. You just need to let them know you have professional representation. You have to show them your teeth. I sat in the warm car and listened to the rain. Okay, I said. 2 days later, the entire situation collapsed into something much darker than a legal dispute. It was Saturday afternoon. I was running a simple grocery errand at the local Kroger supermarket. The rain had finally stopped, but the sky remained a bruised, heavy gray. The air smelled of wet asphalt and rotting autumn leaves. I pushed my shopping cart out of the sliding glass doors and into the vast parking lot. The metal wheels rattled loudly over the uneven pavement. I turned down the third row of cars and my breath caught sharply in my throat. Craig was standing at the back of a dark sport utility vehicle. He was loading brown paper grocery bags into the trunk. We saw each other at the exact same moment. There was no polite avenue of escape. I could not turn my car around without acknowledging him, and he could not close his trunk fast enough to drive away. We were trapped in the damp freezing air. Craig closed the heavy rear door of his vehicle. He did not look angry. That was the hardest part to digest. He looked deeply exhausted. He wore a heavy wool sweater and his shoulders slumped as he walked slowly toward my shopping cart. This was a man who had practiced this conversation in his head 100 times, and he still did not know how to start, Maggie Craig said. He stopped a few feet away. Can we talk for just a minute? I kept both hands firmly wrapped around the cold plastic handle of my cart. Okay. I did not know Mom was taking the money from the accounts belonging to Avery and Co., Craig said. His words rushed out, tripping over each other. I swear to you I did not know. I looked directly into his eyes. You really did not know. Craig looked down at the wet pavement. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. I knew the tuition was being paid. I knew I did not have the money to cover it. He stopped speaking for a moment. He looked back up and his expression was caught somewhere between guilt and self-preservation. I did not ask where the money came from. I should have asked her. I know that now, but I did not ask. Those are two very different things, Craig, I told him. The wind whipped across the parking lot, cutting through my jacket. I know, Craig pleaded. His voice grew softer. But Maggie, if you do this, my kids will not have a school to go to in the middle of the academic year. My mother could face actual criminal charges. She could go to prison. I did not steal the money, I reminded him. I did not create this situation. I do not know where she got it, Craig repeated almost as if he were trying to convince himself. That is what I have to tell myself, but I am asking you to please think about the entire family before you destroy everything. I stare at the brother of my husband. I watched the golden child of Loretta Calloway actively choose his own comfort over the future of my children. He was not an evil villain plotting in the shadows. He was simply a coward. He did not want to know the truth because the truth would cost him his comfortable life. His refusal to look at reality was a choice, and that choice had actively funded his children's education while bankrupting mine. You just used your mother's words, I said quietly. Craig stopped. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He realized exactly what he had just done. I stood in the cold parking lot and felt a profound bone-deep exhaustion settle over my body. It was not the physical fatigue of a 12-hour hospital shift. It was the spiritual drain of a woman realizing she was fighting a war that nobody else wanted her to win. I thought about my father. He was a kind, quiet man who spent 30 years welding metal pipes to provide for our family. He had yielded to every single demand my mother's family ever made. He swallowed his pride, he silenced his objections, and he compromised his own desires just to keep the peace. He called it love. But when he died, nobody remembered his sacrifices. They only remembered that he was easy to control. I looked at Craig standing in his expensive wool sweater. I realized that keeping the peace only ever benefits the people who are breaking the rules. My father was a good man, but he is not the person I want to be. I cannot give Avery and Cole an example of surrender and call it love. Craig, I said. The cold air stung my lungs. I am sorry. This would be hard for your family. I am truly sorry for your children. But I am not sorry for doing what needs to be done. I pushed my heavy cart past him. The wheels rattled aggressively over the asphalt. I did not look back. I reached my sedan, loaded my groceries into the trunk, and drove away. In the rearview mirror, I could see Craig standing in the exact same spot, watching my car disappear into the gray afternoon. He never called out my name. That night, the heavy weight of the entire ordeal finally crushed the breath out of me. It was 11 o'clock. I sat entirely alone on a narrow wooden bench in the staff locker room at Riverside Hospital. The room smelled of industrial bleach and institutional soap. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed a monotonous angry tune overhead. I had not changed into my scrubs yet. My open locker door stood like a small metal shield beside me. My mobile phone rested heavily on my lap. The screen was illuminated. I was looking at the email from Loretta's lawyer again. I read the confident, arrogant words of an attorney who believed he could bully a tired nurse into submission. I thought about the conversation with Craig in the parking lot. I thought about the sheer, terrifying momentum of a family desperate to protect a lie. They had the resources. They had a legal strategy. They had the unwavering belief that they were entirely justified in taking what belonged to my children. I looked down at my hands. The skin was dry and cracked. I felt small. I felt incredibly, desperately isolated. I had the bank records and the timeline, but I was standing at the bottom of a massive mountain, and the people at the top were rolling boulders down directly at my head. For the very first time since I opened that white envelope in my dark kitchen so many weeks ago, a terrifying thought crept into the back of my mind and refused to leave. They are stronger than me. They have been doing this for decades. I turned the phone screen off. The locker room plunged into shadows. I sat perfectly still in the quiet, smelling the bleach and listening to the hum of the lights, and I finally admitted the one thing I had been fighting against from the very beginning. I might actually lose. The drive home from the hospital locker room took 25 minutes. I do not remember a single traffic light or intersection along the way. My hands steered the sedan through the dark, empty streets of Columbus, while my mind remained trapped under the crushing weight of Loretta and her expensive downtown lawyers. I pulled into our driveway at 1:30 in the morning. The house was completely dark. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. It was Tuesday morning technically, but it felt like the dead center of an endless night. I followed my rigid post-shift routine. I dropped my car keys into the small ceramic bowl sitting on the kitchen counter. I left my white hospital shoes right by the back door. Usually, I would walk straight up the wooden stairs, quietly undress in the dark bedroom, and sleep for 6 hours. This time, I did not go to the stairs. I walked into the kitchen and sat down at the heavy wooden table. My laptop was still sitting there, closed and silent. The thick green plastic folder containing the bank records rested right beside it. I did not reach out to open either of them. The faint sharp smell of hospital antiseptic clung to my hair and my clothes. It was my signature scent, a permanent fixture in my life after so many years on the intensive care floor. The small yellow bulb above the stove cast long tired shadows across the room. It was the exact same yellow light that had illuminated the first bank letter 10 weeks ago. The refrigerator ice maker suddenly clattered, dropping frozen cubes into the plastic bin. The sound echoed loudly in the quiet house. I rested my hands flat on the wooden tabletop. My skin was dry and rough against the smooth varnish. Outside the window over the sink, there was absolutely nothing to see. The November darkness was absolute. I sat there and did absolutely nothing. For me, that was entirely unnatural. I am a charge nurse. I am a mother. I am a wife. I always have a next step. I always have a patient to check a lunch, to pack a bill, to pay, or a crisis to manage. But sitting in that yellow light, I had no next step. I was genuinely profoundly exhausted. It had been 10 weeks since I opened that white envelope. My green folder was packed with transaction logs and legal timelines. The suspicious activity report was already filed by the bank. Phil Garrett stood firmly on my side. My husband had finally stopped making excuses for his mother. I had gathered an entire arsenal of truth, and yet I still could not see a clear path forward that did not involve causing terrible pain to people I loved. Loretta was never going to apologize. She was never going to voluntarily return the funds. Craig had made his position perfectly clear in the grocery store parking lot. He could not be my ally because protecting his own comfort was far more important than protecting my children. If I pushed this forward, if I hired an attorney and dragged this theft into the harsh light of the legal system, I would become the villain of the Calloway family. That was how the story would be told at every future Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner. The narrative would not be about the $63,000 Loretta stole. The narrative would be about how Maggie tore a loving family into pieces. I would be the outsider who ruined everything. But if I surrendered, if I simply closed the green folder and walked up those stairs to sleep, I knew exactly what would happen. 2 years from now, Avery would log into her college portal to pay her application fees. She would see a balance of $4,214. I pictured her face from the college fair, the absolute brightness in her eyes when she talked about the architecture program. I pictured the exact moment the light would die. I pushed my chair back from the table. The wood scraped softly against the linoleum. I walked over to the kitchen counter and opened the bottom drawer. It was where we kept the spare batteries, the rolled-up takeaway menus, and a small worn leather photo album. I brought the album back to the table. I opened the thick pages. I turned past the glossy photographs of Avery and Cole as toddlers. I turned past our early vacation pictures. I stopped at a small black and white photograph tucked into the corner of the last page. It was a picture of my father. He was standing in front of his welding rig, wearing a heavy canvas jacket and holding a protective mask under his arm. He was looking directly into the camera lens with a soft, tired smile. My father was a thoroughly decent man. He spent 30 years yielding to every single demand my mother and her extended family ever made. If there was a disagreement, he conceded. If there was an argument over money or time or property, he stepped back and let them have their way. He believed that sacrificing his own voice was the ultimate expression of love. He thought he was buying peace for our house, but when he passed away, his relatives did not talk about his generosity. They did not honor his massive sacrifices. They only remembered him as a quiet man who was incredibly easy to control. His lifelong surrender had not earned him their respect. It had only guaranteed his own erasure. I traced the edge of the old photograph with my thumb. He thought yielding was love. Perhaps in his own gentle heart it truly was. But I could not afford to give my daughter that kind of example. Teaching a young woman to swallow injustice simply to keep a polite dinner table intact is not love. It is a slow, quiet poison. I closed the leather album. I did not feel a sudden surge of heroic energy. I did not feel a fiery, dramatic rage. I just felt a cold, solid settling of the earth beneath my feet. I picked up my mobile phone from the table. The screen illuminated the dark space. I had a single unread text message. It was from Dana Okafor. The timestamp said 11 o'clock at night. Mrs. Calloway, I want you to know our bank has finalized the internal documentation. We are fully prepared to support your family if you decide to proceed with law enforcement. The decision remains entirely yours. I read the message 3 times. A senior compliance officer at a major financial institution does not send a text message at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night unless she specifically wants the recipient to see it before they go to sleep. She was stepping outside her rigid professional boundaries to offer a lifeline. The bank was ready. The documentation was secured. I was the only person involved in this entire ordeal who was still standing still. I set the photograph of my father down on the table. I looked at the dark screen of my laptop. I was not my father. I was not Loretta Calloway. I was a mother sitting in a quiet kitchen at 1:30 in the morning, holding a folder full of evidence with a daughter sleeping upstairs who deserved the future we had built for her. I opened the contact list on my phone. I scrolled past the names of my coworkers and my family members. I found the contact information Phil Garrett had forwarded to me earlier in the week. A civil litigation attorney. I saved the number to my favorites list. I finally stood up from the wooden table. I turned off the yellow kitchen light. The darkness swallowed the room completely, but I no longer felt like I was stumbling blind. Wednesday morning brought a thin gray light through the kitchen windows. The coffee pot was brewing, filling the house with a rich, dark scent. I stood by the counter, holding my phone to my ear. I had called Dana Okafor the moment her office hours began. Her voice came through the speaker crisp and entirely devoid of emotional color. It was exactly the kind of precision I needed to hear. I can confirm the complete file is ready, Dana told me. The suspicious activity report was originally filed in April of this year. We have fully documented all 23 transactions. We pulled the wire transfer records showing the exact routing from the college savings plans directly into the personal checking account held by Loretta Calloway. I watched the steam rise from my coffee mug. Phil mentioned the withdrawal amounts were deliberately kept under the reporting threshold. That is correct, Dana said. But more importantly, we pulled the authorization forms from the local branch. Loretta Calloway signed a physical transfer request for every single one of those 23 wires. Furthermore, every single request was formally notarized by a branch employee. I stopped breathing for a second. She went into the bank and signed a paper every time. 23 times, Dana confirmed. This establishes a clear pattern of premeditation. It removes any potential defense that this was a singular technological error or a momentary lapse in judgment. She executed a deliberate repeated action over 14 months. I thought about the email from Loretta's downtown lawyer. Her attorney claims the access form Neil signed gives her the absolute right to do this. The access form grants administrative entry to the portal, Dana explained smoothly. It does not grant fiduciary distribution rights. This is a vital legal distinction. Ohio Revised Code, Section 1339.69, governs these specific accounts. A trustee or custodian managing an account designated for a minor is legally obligated to act exclusively for the benefit of that named minor. The funds cannot be used for the general welfare of the extended family. They cannot be redistributed to other grandchildren. The law exists to protect the specific child named on the paperwork. I leaned against the kitchen counter, the cold granite pressed against my arm. Does her lawyer know about that specific code? They are fully aware of it, Dana said. Her tone remained perfectly flat. That is exactly why their correspondence to your husband was phrased so carefully. They did not explicitly claim she had the right to spend the money on someone else. They only claimed she possessed authorized access. Those are two entirely different things, and they are aggressively hoping you do not know the difference. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The hot liquid burned the back of my throat slightly. The lawyer was playing a calculated game of intimidation. They were using big firm letterhead and confident vocabulary to build a paper wall, hoping Neil and I would simply turn around and walk away. "Thank you, Dana," I said. "I am meeting with a lawyer on Friday." "You have all the documentation you need," Mrs. Calloway Dana replied. "The bank will comply with any subpoenas your counsel issues." The call ended. I set the phone down next to the coffee maker. The information flowed into my mind, organizing itself into neat, actionable columns. The fear that had paralyzed me in the locker room was completely gone. I finally understood the rules of the game Loretta was playing, and I realized she was holding an incredibly weak hand. Friday morning arrived with a sharp drop in temperature. I drove to the office of Patricia Lang. She was the civil attorney Phil Garrett had highly recommended. Her office was not located in a towering glass skyscraper downtown. It was situated in a renovated brick building on a quiet side street. I walked into her workspace. It was small and densely packed. Heavy legal volumes lined the walls from the floor to the ceiling. Stacks of manila folders covered every available flat surface. A warm brass desk lamp illuminated a massive wooden desk. The room smelled of old paper, binding glue, and strong black tea. It was not a place designed to impress clients with wealth. It was a place designed for serious, meticulous work. Patricia Lang sat behind the desk. She was a woman in her late 50s, wearing a simple gray sweater and reading glasses pushed up into her dark graying hair. She did not offer me a slick, practiced smile. She simply gestured to the leather guest chair across from her. I sat down and placed the thick green folder on her desk. Patricia opened it. She spent the next 40 minutes reading in absolute silence. I sat quietly and watched her work. She examined the bank records. She studied the timeline Neil and I had drawn on the butcher paper. She read the printed photograph of the Calloway Family Scholarship Fund distribution log. She looked closely at the picture of the custom letterhead. She paused when she reached the email from Phil Garrett. She noted the timestamp showing that Neil had received the warning 6 weeks ago and failed to reply. She recognized immediately that his silence was an act of avoidance, not an act of approval. Finally, she picked up the printed screenshot of the text message Loretta had sent to Neil. "I will make it right later. They are blowing it out of proportion." Patricia set the paper down. She took her glasses down from her hair and placed them on her nose. She looked directly at me. "You have two distinct paths of action here," Patricia said. Her voice was steady and carried the weight of decades of legal experience. "First, we can pursue a civil lawsuit against Loretta Calloway. We will demand the immediate return of the exact principal amount, which is $63,215.44. In addition, we will sue for all associated legal fees, court costs, and the accrued interest those accounts would have earned over the last 14 months. I nodded. That was exactly what I wanted. I wanted Avery and Cole to have their futures restored. Patricia folded her hands on top of the green folder. However, given the evidence of premeditation, the creation of a fraudulent scholarship fund, and the sheer volume of the stolen funds, you also have a second path. You have the grounds to file a formal criminal referral with the Franklin County District Attorney under Ohio Revised Code, Section 291, 3.02. She let the statute number hang in the warm air of the office. "Theft by deception," Patricia clarified. "Because the total amount exceeds $7,500, this would be classified as a felony of the third degree. If the district attorney accepts the referral, the state of Ohio will prosecute her. It will no longer be a family dispute. The leather chair suddenly felt incredibly stiff beneath me. A third-degree felony, a criminal prosecution. I pictured Loretta sitting in a stark courtroom stripped of her blue blazers and her perfect pearls. I pictured Craig having to explain to his children why their grandmother was facing a judge. "I do not want her to go to prison," I said. My voice was quiet, but it was absolutely firm. Patricia did not look surprised. She did not look disappointed. She simply leaned back in her chair and observed me with a look of profound understanding. "That is the difference between restitution and revenge," Patricia said softly. "It is entirely understandable that you do not want to see your husband's mother incarcerated. What you actually want is the power to decide the outcome. She reached forward and tapped her index finger against the green folder. I am not telling you that we must file the criminal referral today. I am telling you that the legal option exists. And the fact that you hold that option changes the entire dynamic of the conversation we are about to have with her attorney. I looked at the stack of evidence sitting under the warm light of the brass lamp. For 16 weeks, Loretta had controlled the narrative. She had taken the money in secret. She had justified it with her own twisted logic. She had hired a downtown lawyer to try and force us into a quiet submission. She had manipulated Craig into becoming her shield. She had held all the power because she believed we were too afraid to cause a scene. We are going to send them a demand letter, Patricia explained. We are going to lay out every single piece of evidence we hold. We are going to show them the bank records, the timeline, the proof of her fraudulent letterhead, and her own text message admitting fault. We are going to give them a very short, very strict window to return every single dollar. And we will make it perfectly clear that if they choose to fight, we will execute both the civil and the criminal options simultaneously. I felt a slow, deep breath fill my lungs. The air in the office smelled like old books and justice. It was not a chaotic, screaming fight in a suburban living room. It was a cold, calculated, and perfectly legal dismantling of a thief. Do it, I told her. Patricia pulled a yellow legal pad toward her and picked up a pen. I will have the draft ready for your review by Monday morning. Once we send this Maggie, the tone of this dispute will change permanently. They will realize you are not backing down. I know, I said. I stood up from the leather chair. I left the thick green folder sitting on her massive wooden desk. I did not need to carry it around anymore. The burden of proof no longer rested on my tired shoulders. I had handed the weapons over to a professional, and I finally knew exactly how this war was going to end. I walked out of the brick building and into the cold Friday afternoon. The sky above Columbus was a brilliant cloudless blue. The biting wind felt clean against my face. I walked toward my parked car with a steady, even stride. I was not angry. I was not afraid. I was simply a mother who had finally found the right way to protect her own. The final week of the ordeal began quietly in my kitchen. It was Monday morning. The early sunlight pushed through the window above the sink, casting a pale cold glow across the countertops. My laptop sat open on the wooden table, resting in the exact same spot where the first white envelope had laid 16 weeks ago. I held a warm ceramic mug of dark coffee in both hands. Neil stood beside me. We were looking at the bright screen together. An email from Patricia Lang had just arrived in my inbox. Attached was a copy of the formal demand letter she had sent via certified mail and electronic delivery to Clifford and Associates. The language on the screen was absolute and unyielding. The demands were laid out in perfectly numbered paragraphs. First, the immediate return of $63,215.44 within 14 days. Second, a signed letter of acknowledgement from Loretta admitting the transactions were entirely unauthorized. Third, her immediate legal removal from every single financial account associated with Avery and Cole. The final paragraph stated clearly that failure to meet these terms within the 14-day window would result in a simultaneous civil lawsuit and a formal criminal referral to the Franklin County District Attorney. Neil read the text in silence. I could hear his steady breathing. He reached out and rested his hand on the back of the wooden chair. We cannot take this back now, Neil said softly. I took a sip of my coffee. It was bitter and perfectly hot. We do not need to take it back. Thursday morning arrived with a heavy overcast sky. We drove downtown to the office of Patricia Lang. It was 10 o'clock. We were shown into a small conference room near the back of the brick building. The room was strictly functional. A dark, heavy wooden table dominated the center of the space. The overhead lights were a bright, unforgiving white. The central air conditioning pushed a steady, monotonous hum through the ceiling vents. 2 clear glasses of ice water sat untouched on our side of the table. 2 matching glasses sat untouched on the opposite side. Patricia sat to my right. Neil sat to my left. At exactly 5 minutes past 10, the heavy wooden door opened. Loretta walked in. She was followed closely by her attorney. Mr. Clifford, was a man in his mid-50s, wearing a tailored gray suit. He carried a thick leather briefcase and had the tired eyes of a man who usually won his cases by simply dragging the procedures out until the other side gave up. Loretta wore a crisp navy blazer with a small pearl brooch pinned to the lapel. Her hair was perfectly sprayed into place. A massive wave of Estee Lauder white linen perfume rolled across the table the moment she sat down. She was dressed for a board meeting. She was dressed to project absolute authority. Patricia did not offer any pleasantries. She did not ask how the drive was. She opened her leather briefcase and pulled out 3 identical thick green folders. She kept one. She slid the second toward me. She pushed the third across the dark wood directly toward Mr. Clifford. "Let us begin," Patricia said. Her voice was calm, authoritative, and entirely devoid of warmth. Patricia opened her folder. She began to lay the documents out on the polished table. The bank records, the timeline mapping the withdrawals to the tuition payments, the copies of the authorization forms. Clifford looked down at the papers. He did not say a word. Loretta looked at the documents, and then she immediately shifted her gaze to Neil. "You did not tell me things had reached this level," Loretta said to her son. Her voice carried a sharp edge of accusation. Neil did not look away from her. "You knew exactly what level this was. You hired a lawyer." Clifford cleared his throat and raised a hand. "We can certainly discuss a reasonable arrangement here to avoid any unnecessary conflict." "Mr. Clifford, please allow me to finish," Patricia interrupted smoothly. She turned the next page in her file. Loretta Ann Calloway signed physical wire authorization forms at the First Midwest Bank branch on August 5th of last year. She signed again on September 3rd. She signed again on October 14th. Patricia read down the list, her voice like a steady drumbeat in the quiet room. She continued this until September 12th of this year, 23 separate times. Every single signature was notarized by a bank official. This was not an automated banking error. These were 23 proactive, deliberate decisions. Loretta pulled her shoulders back. The confident posture she had carried into the room began to look slightly brittle. "I believed I had the right to manage those accounts." "You possessed administrative access," Patricia corrected her. "You did not possess the right to distribute funds to a beneficiary who was not legally named on the account." Ohio Revised Code, Section 1339.69, is incredibly clear on this point. Furthermore, we have a copy of the suspicious activity report your bank submitted to federal authorities regarding your structured withdrawal pattern. And we have the text message you sent to your son, stating you would make it right later. Patricia placed the printed screenshot of the text message on top of the pile. That was the moment the reality of the room finally shifted. Loretta was being forced to listen to the actual law. It was not my opinion. It was not Neil expressing his hurt feelings. It was a statute number read aloud in a room with legal witnesses, backed by a mountain of undeniable paper. Clifford stared at the printed text message. He knew exactly what it meant. He looked at his client, and for the very first time, the expensive downtown lawyer had absolutely nothing to say in her defense. "I did this for the family," Loretta said. Her voice was much smaller now. It lacked the commanding echo it always had in her own dining room. I had sat quietly the entire time. I looked across the table at the woman who had demanded my submission for 22 years. I finally spoke directly to her. "I know you believe that I told her." My voice was perfectly steady. "But your belief does not change the balance in the accounts belonging to Avery and Cole." Clifford leaned over and whispered something very quietly into Loretta's ear. I could not hear the words. Loretta sat rigidly in her heavy wooden chair. She looked down at the 23 pieces of paper, proving she had systematically stolen from her own grandchildren. I looked at her, and I realized I did not feel any sense of glorious victory. I did not feel a rush of triumph. There was no joy in this room at all. It was just profoundly sad. She was an older woman sitting in a sterile office, stripped of her narrative, facing the undeniable proof of her own arrogance. I did not want to destroy her. I just wanted my daughter to have enough money to go to college. Those two desires did not have to conflict, but I could only control one of them. Clifford sat back in his chair. I need to speak privately with my client. Of course, Patricia said. She closed her green folder. We will wait out in the hallway. I stood up. Neil and Patricia followed me out of the conference room. We walked down. Are you okay? He asked very quietly. I looked at my husband. I am okay. And it was the absolute truth. 30 minutes passed under the buzzing fluorescent lights of the hallway. Finally, the conference room door opened. Clifford stepped out and asked Patricia to speak with him privately in her personal office. They disappeared behind another heavy door. 20 minutes after that, Patricia walked out alone. She guided Neil and me back into her office and closed the door firmly. She agreed to the terms, Patricia said, taking her seat behind her desk. She will return the full amount of $63,215.44 within 30 days. She will sign the letter of acknowledgement. She will remove herself from every financial portal. She is not going to contest a single demand. Patricia picked up her pen and tapped it gently against her legal pad. In exchange, your family will formally agree not to file the criminal referral with the district attorney. The decision is entirely yours to make. I stood in front of the desk. I thought about the long, exhausting 16 weeks. I thought about the late nights staring at the ceiling. If I agree to this, I asked, is this a genuine settlement, or is she just buying time to drag this out further? With the evidence we presented and the suspicious activity report already filed, Patricia explained, if she fails to execute the wire transfer within 30 days, the criminal referral remains fully available to you. Attorney Clifford knows this. He explicitly recommended she settle today because this is the very last time she gets to control the outcome of her own life. I turned and looked at Neil. He looked back at me. The shadows of the last few months were still visible in his eyes, but he gave a small firm nod. This is your decision, Neil said. I turned back to Patricia. A heavy silence settled into the warm office. I agree to the settlement, I said. But I have one additional condition that must be met before I sign anything. Craig has to know exactly where that tuition money came from, and Loretta has to be the one to tell him. Patricia stopped tapping her pen. She looked at me closely. She has to tell her oldest son the truth herself, I continued. Not through an email, not through a lawyer. She has to sit down with Craig and explain exactly what she did to his brother's children. It was the one thing no bank transaction could ever fix. Loretta had hidden behind her golden child for months. Craig had chosen the comfort of ignorance over the painful reality of the truth. If they were going to avoid a criminal courtroom, they were going to have to face each other in the harsh light of their own actions. Patricia wrote the condition down on her yellow pad. I will make it a binding contingency of the settlement. The feeling that washed over me was not the easy relief of a cheap victory. It was the deep settling peace of a true resolution. It was the feeling of standing on completely equal ground for the very first time in 22 years. Thursday evening arrived with a quiet grace. The house was calm. Cole was in his bedroom finishing a science project. Neil was upstairs taking a warm shower. The sound of the water running through the pipes was a familiar, comforting background noise. I stood at the kitchen counter. I was brewing a fresh pot of decaffeinated coffee. It was Thursday night, and for the first time in a very long time, I did not have a night shift at the hospital. The yellow bulb above the stove cast a warm, familiar light across the room. It was the exact same light that had illuminated the kitchen 16 weeks ago. The refrigerator ice maker clattered, dropping frozen cubes into the plastic bin. I looked at the small ceramic bowl sitting near the toaster. My car keys rested inside it. My white hospital shoes sat neatly by the back door. There was no white envelope sitting on the counter tonight. There was absolutely nothing left to decode. Avery sat at the wooden kitchen table. She was wearing an oversized gray sweatshirt. Her dark hair was pulled up into a messy knot. She was scrolling through something on her mobile phone. She looked up when she heard the coffee pot finish brewing. You are home early. I do not have a shift tonight, I told her. I reached into the cupboard and pulled out 2 ceramic mugs. Avery looked back down at her screen and then quickly looked up at me again. Her eyes were bright. Mom, that Ohio State University open house we talked about in December, can I go ahead and register for it? I poured the dark coffee into my mug. I looked at my 16-year-old daughter. She was tired from a long week of high school classes, but the excitement in her voice was impossible to hide. That face, that exact expression was the reason I had fought a war she would never even know about. "Yes," I said smoothly. "Go ahead and register." Avery smiled. It was a massive, genuine smile. "Are you serious? You do not want to think about the application fees or the travel costs first?" "I have already thought about it," I said. "Mom, their architecture program is supposed to be amazing." "I know it is," I told her. "Register for the event." Avery immediately bent her head over her phone. Her thumbs moved rapidly across the glass screen. I walked over and sat down in the wooden chair next to her. I held my warm mug in both hands. There was absolutely no way to explain the last 16 weeks to her. Not tonight, and perhaps not ever. Avery did not know that her college portal had been systematically drained until it was nearly empty. She did not know what her grandmother had done in the dark. She did not know about the lawyers or the bank reports or the cold parking lot conversations. She only knew that she asked her mother a question about her future, and her mother had said yes. I watched her type. I did not feel like a triumphant hero. I just felt like a mother sitting in her kitchen on a Thursday night. This exact moment was what I had spent months fighting to protect. I did not endure the confrontation for a grand sense of justice. I did it so my daughter could sit at this table and plan her life without fear. The mobile phone in Neil's pocket vibrated upstairs. I heard the faint muffled sound of his voice as he answered it. A few minutes later, his heavy footsteps sounded on the wooden stairs. Neil walked into the kitchen. He wore a clean gray shirt and faded jeans. He stopped near the edge of the room and looked at the two of us sitting at the table. He walked over and pulled out the chair directly next to me. He sat down. He did not say a word. He just watched Avery scrolling through a list of campus dormitories. I did not turn my head to look at him, but I let him sit there beside me in the warm yellow light. 22 years of marriage. Things had been severely broken over the last 16 weeks. Some of those pieces were still sharp, and some of the wounds were still healing. We had a massive amount of work to do to rebuild the trust that had been compromised. But he was sitting right here on my side of the table. That did not fix everything instantly, but it was certainly not nothing. Avery looked up from her screen. "Mom, it's December 7th, a good day for the open house." "Let me check the calendar," I said. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I opened my work schedule for December. I found the 7th day of the month. The block was completely clear. No hospital shifts. No obligations. "Yes," I said. "December 7th works perfectly." Avery let out a short, happy cheer. She tapped the confirmation button on her screen. The noise brought Cole out of his bedroom. He poked his head out from the hallway. "What is going on out here?" Ohio State little brother Avery told him proudly. "Oh," Cole said, immediately losing interest. He pulled his head back into the hallway and shut his bedroom door. I took a slow, deep breath of the coffee-scented air. I looked at the ceramic bowl on the counter. I looked at the hospital shoes by the door. The warm light covered the room like a blanket. Everything was exactly in its proper place. I was not in my old place anymore. I was no longer the quiet woman who swallowed her words to keep a false peace. I had stepped entirely out of that shadow. And as I sat there listening to my daughter talk about her future, I realized that was not a bad thing at all. Sometimes the hardest thing you will ever do is look at the people you call family and refuse to play by their broken rules. We are often taught that keeping the peace is the ultimate virtue, and that swallowing your objections is the price you pay for a seat at the holiday table. But true loyalty should never require you to sacrifice the future of your own children. When you uncover a betrayal hiding behind a polite smile, you must realize that staying silent does not protect your family. It only protects the person who is doing the breaking. Walking away from blind compliance is not an act of destruction. It is an act of profound protection for the people who actually depend on you. Have you ever had to draw a difficult line with a relative to protect someone you love, even when everyone else wanted you to just stay quiet? Share your story in the comments below, because your courage might be exactly what another woman needs to hear today.